Cyber threats target digital identities. Do you know who or what is accessing your company's apps, systems, and data? You need to know who's there, who to let in, and who to keep out. And you'll need more than access management to stay secure. You need SailPoint Identity Security. As the leader in identity security, SailPoint can help mature your security resilience while driving efficiencies and compliance for your organization. Start your identity journey with SailPoint's free maturity assessment. Go to securityweekly.com/SailPoint to get your free identity security assessment today. Are you constantly thinking about how to keep your enterprise as secure as possible? Get to know Chrome Enterprise, the trusted browser for security-conscious professionals like you. Its ease of use for IT and security teams and added access controls protect the remote, extended, and hybrid workforce, keeping your entire enterprise safe. Don't settle for a browser that compromises your organization. Visit securityweekly.com/Chrome Enterprise now to learn more and start protecting your enterprise like never before. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. You can now find us on Instagram. Follow us for highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at SecWeekly. That's @SecWeekly. All right. This interview is sponsored by AT&T Cybersecurity. Theresa Lanowitz and Chris Goettl join us today to talk about securing edge computing. Theresa was an industry analyst at Gartner, launched the Gartner Application and Innovation Solutions Summit, and is now head of cybersecurity evangelism at AT&T Cybersecurity. Welcome to the show, Theresa.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here again.
Yeah, I should say welcome back, right? You were here a few episodes ago. Yeah. All right. And Chris has over 15 years of experience working in IT, hosts a monthly webinar focusing on Patch Tuesday and other vulnerabilities, and is the VP of Product Management at Ivanti. Welcome to the show, Chris. I'm not hearing you. I'm hoping.
Oh, yep. Sorry, I had my audio muted there. Thanks, Sam. It's great to be here.
I'm hoping Goettl is the right pronunciation. Yes. Yeah,
that's correct.
Okay. All right. And so today we're going to be talking about securing edge computing. And maybe I'll go to you, Theresa, and let's just kind of redefine what edge computing is. I'm going to pull up the last episode we had just so we can refer people back to it, because we covered edge computing pretty thoroughly there, and we talked about the report that you guys released. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and give us a shorter.
Just so some, kind of a brief highlight on what edge computing is. And edge computing is one of those terms you hear all the time, and everybody has a different definition. So for the purposes of the report that we wrote, we said edge computing has three primary characteristics: software defined, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud; that your workloads, your applications, your hosting, it's closer to where that data is being generated and consumed, so you can get that near real-time digital first experience. And then the third characteristic is that it's a distributed model of management, intelligence, and networks. So that's how, when I talk about edge computing, that's how I really frame the discussion around edge computing and what it is.
All right. And that episode number is 325. Where we last had you on and went over the insights report.
Yep.
All right. And Chris, how do you I know Ivanti, for people who don't know, maybe give us a quick overview of what Ivanti does. I was actually an industry analyst, I think, when it rolled up a bunch of different companies like Heat Software and I forget the whole list, but Ivanti is if people don't know, does a lot of stuff these days.
Absolutely. So I would say one of the key things to kind of frame up what we do at Ivanti is we are helping organizations through their SaaS transformation. There's still a lot of technologies. Actually, the edge computing challenge is one that kind of focuses on the same thing. How do you go and expand your business out in a variety of different ways to better meet the market needs today? So whether it's, discovering and managing endpoints, being able to secure or remediate threats on those endpoints, or being able to understand the digital experience of your users and deliver better service and solutions to them. All of that is kind of what Ivanti helps do. And that intersection around edge computing is definitely a strong one for us. We partner with AT&T and provide a lot of solutions that help AT&T customers as well. And really, a lot of it is that being able to bridge the gap between on-premise and working through that SaaS transformation. A majority of the market is still right in the middle of that transformation.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so maybe, I think something that might help us here, maybe some examples of what edge computing looks like. What kind of devices, what kind of use cases. So whoever wants to run with that, I think that'll help us get a better grasp of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I'll jump in here with a couple of use cases. And I think it's so interesting because this whole concept of edge computing, it's the next evolution in computing. Computing started to become democratized from the time we had mainframe applications, and they were sitting in that big server room behind glass. And the moment we democratized computing and came out of that data center, we started to have evolution of computing. So PC, then we moved to mobile, cloud, web applications, and now we have these edge applications. And I think that these evolutions occur fairly quickly over time, and sometimes we don't even realize it. But if you look at some of these edge computing use cases, some of the big use cases that we got back from the people we surveyed in our AT&T Cybersecurity Insights report, one of my favorites is video quality inspection on the assembly line. So in a manufacturing facility, you're using a series of cameras and sensors to watch as whatever that product is that you're making be made. And so if there's some type of defect that enters in on the assembly line, they can stop that assembly line, pinpoint where the defect was actually entered, and be able to remediate. So what that does from a business perspective is it says it costs us less in terms of shipping bad products out to the market or possibly recalls, that sort of thing. So there's a big business outcome that these edge computing use cases help with. The other one I think that is really, really fascinating is using robots as an endpoint. So using robots in smart warehousing. So this idea of smart warehousing, being able to understand exactly what you have in your warehouse. And then once you start taking a look at some of the top use cases in different types of vertical markets, you see that manufacturing and transportation, they suddenly start to converge a little bit. Because one of the things that manufacturers are doing is they're saying, we want to use edge computing for smart inventory. We want to understand how much type of a good that we have on hand to be able to produce whatever it is we're making, whether it's clothing or cars. They need to understand how much of those raw materials they have on hand. And then from a transportation perspective, they always want to know where their fleet is. That was one of the top use cases in transportation. So, and a manufacturer wants to know how much of a certain material should I have on hand. And then once they ship that through their manufacturing component or arm or partner, they then want to know where is it in transit. Have the sweaters that I made, have they reached my destination in time for, the fall season when people are starting to buy sweaters? Where are the cars that I produced? Where are they en route to getting to the dealership so people can actually buy them? So you suddenly start to see a lot of these edge use cases converge. So there's some really, really innovative edge use cases going on, a lot of innovation happening through edge computing use cases.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of it's going to be more on the OT manufacturing side. I mean, it sounds like cars themselves, whether it's a commercial fleet or personal vehicles, would be considered edge computing devices, right?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, and I think you're right. There's a lot of OT convergence with IT, but also if you look at healthcare, for example, they're looking at things such as wearables for remote patient monitoring. So somebody has surgery and the physician wants to monitor their vitals. They send them home with some type of wearable watch so that they can monitor their vitals on a near real-time basis and being able to understand what's going on with that particular patient. Another interesting use case that we saw with healthcare was the use of robots inside of a hospital or a doctor's office to disinfect rooms between patients. So in a doctor's office, having a robot go in and be able to wipe down the exam table, or in a hospital, having a robot be able to go in and disinfect the room between patients. So there's a lot of really interesting use cases, but as you pointed out, there's a lot on the OT side, and that's what we found from our research as well, that there's a lot going on the OT side.
Can you help me to understand, I just heard what you said, and it's really fascinating, but can you help me to understand, so we know that this IT-OT convergence is happening. We also know that a lot of these OT devices are just not as manageable from a security side, but what happens like when you're in a patient environment? What happens when a doctor gives somebody who might be a Luddite one of these wearables? What kinds of risks are introduced? What kinds of risks are introduced when somebody, maybe they're tech savvy, but they're at home and now they're in an environment where they're connecting over who knows what? And then you're monitoring all this patient data, which of course is protected by numerous regulations and laws and all this stuff. So what's happening here? What do the risks look like? What can companies do about it, especially in healthcare environments, for instance, where security isn't quite as savvy as maybe some other fields?
Yeah, I think those are, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, I think this is definitely a key part of this transformation. Is we are pushing devices further and further out, so our attack surface is expanding. That attack surface is also changing. We're going from a lot more manageable devices to your point, OT devices are less oftentimes manageable. They have only certain things that you can do around that. So the way that we have to manage and the way that we have to monitor these devices really does change. More of what we need to worry about is around providing a good digital service as well. So to your, you made a point in there about some of these people might not be tech savvy. We have to make very easy to use devices that somebody's going to be able to interact with. Well, at the same time, they may be used without any interaction from staff at all. You could have a virtual kiosk for check-in, and there might be 5 of them out there, and it's 20 feet away from anybody in the healthcare organization, and they may not even know how to help you with that. So the ability to, first of all, secure those devices, because they're exposed in a lot of ways that devices typically weren't over the years, along with the fact that we have to be very aware and have much better self-healing capabilities built into these devices and experiences, has definitely changed. Attack surface management in general is becoming more and more of a critical challenge for organizations. Think about just this month, there was a vulnerability in WebP that basically affected every major browser out there, and it was actively being exploited. Organizations now have, a lot of them, I've spoken to a couple just recently, that have 48-hour turnaround times for remediating a vulnerability like that. We have to be able to identify, make decisions, and move quicker on security resolutions than we've ever had to before. And we've got the challenge of operationally putting devices out in an environment where the experience is even more critical than ever. If we've got somebody, so the healthcare use cases in the report talked about transitioning from consumer virtual care into more tele-emergency medical services. Think about all of the remote care options that people have today. If they have challenges just getting connected up to be able to access and get that care, that's going to be a significant challenge. So knowing more about that digital experience, being able to understand without having to have that person communicate with somebody at a support desk or a help desk to be able to get help is critical. So having automation, self-healing capabilities, and the ability to get telemetry off of a device to understand the overall experience and understand if that experience is degrading in any way and be able to respond quickly to that is definitely paramount.
Yeah, and a couple of things Chris mentioned, I wanted to just echo as well. The whole idea of simplicity is really critical. You mentioned somebody being given some type of wearable to go home with after surgery. And what if they are a Luddite? It has to be frictionless. So from a design perspective, from a software development perspective, from a connectivity perspective, it has to be very, very easy to use so that somebody, maybe after surgery, they're not feeling that well. In this example that we were using, you have to be able to have that simplicity built into that. And I think one of the other things that we're starting to see because of this, as Chris mentioned, we have all of these devices, all of these endpoints now out there at the edge. And that edge is wherever that client, wherever that customer, that consumer is using that endpoint or that device. But what it also really starts to say to IT organizations specifically is you have to start to work together. We've seen in IT over the past 4 or 5 plus decades that we've had these silos built up. We have our app dev team, we have our operations team, our networking team, our security team, line of business, and people in those different organizations, they pretty much tend to stay in those silos. So there's a lot more communication and collaboration that has to happen as well. And design does become critical. We all know that it is far more difficult to design something that is simple to use than it is to design something that's complex to use. And we have to go down that path of simplicity.
And Theresa, the problem is we're designing it simple to use, or trying to make it simple to use, while shoving more and more data in and through it, right? So it has to seem simple, but it can't actually be simple.
Exactly. That's the point, right? It has to seem simple, but it actually, when you pull back the covers, it's fairly complex. And, I think one of the greatest pieces of simplicity that we've all seen probably in the last couple decades is, take a look at when search engines were something that were brand new. We had a host of search engines out there that were cluttered with news feeds and ads and stock feeds and everything else. And along comes Google with their search engine, and it's pretty simple. There's just a search bar, just type in what you want to do. And that is very simple to the end user, but beneath it all, there's a lot of complexity that goes on there. So I think that's a really great example of simple design.
So I want to shift a little bit, especially when we're talking about IOMT, the Internet of Medical Things technology, because we are talking about things like wearables. Obviously, there's a lot more than that. But when it comes to those types of devices, and even when you're talking about putting these in doctors' offices, and maybe you've got individual doctors' offices, they're not in a hospital setting, they don't have the IT or the security support, they're just individual offices that rely on technology because they're there and it's 2023. How does liability shift when we're talking about these different stakeholders, these different users, these different levels of people who may or may not have an understanding or even support for a lot of this technology? Is there some sort of a liability shift that's going on? I know what the regulatory environment looks like. It's not great. It's certainly confusing, but what are you seeing and what are you hearing when you're talking about the use of these things and supply chain on the tail end of it?
Yeah, supply chain becomes a... Go ahead,
Theresa.
No, I was just going to say supply chain becomes a really interesting component of that because you can't necessarily control everything. So you have to have that relationship within your supply chain. And, we've seen different types of legislation come out, different types of guidelines and rules that say if you're deploying these IoT types of devices, you cannot deploy them with the factory set password. And in many cases, the manufacturer will not even allow you to deploy with the factory set password. So there are things that are happening, I think, across the suppliers of all types to really sort of limit the risk of something happening.
Yeah, and I would say there's definitely a lot of additional complexities happening with any organization's choice in a vendor. So we've seen a increase in the complexity of vendor risk assessments going on. The number of vendors that you're onboarding in an organization now really matters more than ever. We've got companies who are coming to us saying, hey, I need to figure out how to go from 50 vendors down to 35 vendors this year. What can you help me to consolidate there? And one of the major drivers for that is just all of the overhead that comes with interacting with each of those vendors. From a supply chain perspective, not only do you have that medical device, but you've got everything that device has to interact with. There's an entire ecosystem there, from the discovery of a device, implementation, all the things it interacts with. You may not even be able to manage some of these devices directly. So we have a partnership with a vendor called Scenario. This is a really good example in the healthcare world, again, where medical devices, to preserve their FDA approval here in the US, they need to stay configured exactly the way that they've been approved to run. So that means you can't get in, manipulate, and lock things down in all sorts of different ways. It has to be exactly the way that it was approved to run. So what that means is you need to protect at a slightly different level. So a vendor like Scenario knows how that device should be configured, and they can look at that aspect, but they can also protect at a slightly different level. So north, south, and east, west traffic interactions with that device are where we have to protect a lot of these edge devices, because they can't be directly managed, either because they limit the amount that you can interact and configure them, or because they have specific requirements that you have to meet to be able to even run that device. The privacy aspect is definitely challenging on top of that as well. You've got more and more increased kind of scrutiny over what a device is collecting. The types of, every time I do a product release on any of my product lines now, I have to go through in-depth questionnaires about what's all being collected, how is it used, is there any telemetry being pulled on that? If there is it being anonymized? How is it being anonymized? And even if you've met all those requirements, a customer could come in and be like, no, you need to explain it all to me, or I'm not going to buy this product. So it has gotten infinitely more complicated as this evolution has been continuing.
And there's some interesting challenges there, right? Like I presume, like the early example of the cameras on the assembly line, latency, it can be a difficult challenge for some of these devices. As you add encryption and resilience and stuff like that, oftentimes latency is impacted. And also talking about how a lot of these devices are consumer facing. Again, you've got usability requirements and ADA and accessibility requirements and things like that. That kind of limits some of the stuff that you can do. How does somebody type in a password if they can't type, right?
Yeah, so a lot of go ahead, Theresa.
Go ahead, Chris. No, go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say, yeah, the different types of assessments like that are even down to geographical levels. So the U.S. has their version of those types of criteria. Canada has theirs. The EU has theirs. Different parts of the globe each have their different requirements on that. They're mostly very similar, but you may even have to go through and get certified down to those specific labs who approve that you've met those criteria. So are you providing a user interface that can work for somebody who's blind, who's deaf, who's unable to type? All of those things are definitely driving a lot more complexity for the vendor who needs to deliver it. So to Theresa's earlier statement, like, we need to deliver something that looks simpler, but under the covers, it's definitely a lot more complex to deliver start to finish.
Yeah, and what I would add to Chris's comment is, again, the whole idea of tearing down those silos that have been built up and really expanding that team, because now you have to have people on your team who are really design focused. And probably in the past, you may not have had those people who are specifically design focused. And those designers are looking at everything from the user experience to accessibility and so on. So the the removal of those silos is really important, but also expanding what that team looks like to actually put a product or a service or an offering or some type of edge computing use case to market. That it really starts to change and shift.
Let's talk about that for a second. I know it's sort of out of scope of the report, but it's a really important point, Theresa, because you keep bringing up the idea of eliminating these silos. And so we've been talking about it for years. It's becoming more and more important. We're seeing some of these things happen, but in your experience, in your your ability to talk to so many customers and people in the security and IT world, what are some of the strategies that are working best for that? Because we do still have that natural friction between security and IT. But as we were talking about before, it's not just about security and IT. It's about business stakeholders. It's about users. It's, if we're talking about the medical field, it's about doctors and nurses and technicians and admins. And how do you break down some of those barriers in a world that looks like 2023 with some of the current distributed networks, distributed devices, IoT, IIoT, OT, IOMT, all the acronyms? How do you do that?
Yeah, you're right. We have been talking about this for years. I can remember when I was an analyst talking to clients, and they're saying, we have this development team and we have this operations team, and they have similar goals, but they have competing priorities that they have to get done. The same thing held true for security. So we've been talking about it for a couple of decades, at least, as far as I can tell. But one of the things that we started to see in 2022, when we were doing this AT&T Cybersecurity Insights report in 2022, is we started to get some comments back from people who were saying, there's a need to sort of erode the silos. There's a need to be able to have the application development team work with a security team, for example, or to have somebody from the line of business really be very clear about what it is the business outcome wants to be. And I think there are really two ways that we start to see these silos start to erode. And unfortunately, in one case, it's if something bad happens, if there's some type of event that causes maybe a cyber incident, if there's some sort of, app that doesn't do something, that doesn't perform well, you suddenly start to see from the top down, the organization being really mandated to say, you teams, you need to work together better. And that's an unfortunate situation, but the byproduct ends up being pretty good because you start to erode those silos. The other is that you have a really innovative leader who really understands the necessity to work cross-functionally. And if you have that innovative leader is really saying, all right, security, you're part of everything we're doing. You're a business requirement. You're not just a bunch of really smart people sitting off in the corner somewhere by yourselves and telling us when something bad happens. You're part of our overall business plan or business strategy, and it's a business requirement. So having those innovative leaders really understand what is going on, if you do have those silos, I think really goes a long way in starting to eradicate that. And, it's behavior that we have had inside of IT organizations for probably since the 1960s. So it's behavior that has been ingrained in a culture over a long period of time, and it does take some time to overcome it.
Yeah, and I think Theresa's taking Theresa's comments a little bit one step further. Like I spent a lot of time in my career more in the vulnerability management and patch remediation side. That's an area where you absolutely have to have security and IT working together. But Theresa's point of two teams with similar goals but different mandates is very accurate. Security is focused on reducing risk to the environment. IT is their primary goal is keeping the environment operational. Now they're having to work together more than ever. So one of the things that I really liked about the Cybersecurity Insights report this year was the seeing how many of the organizations that were going through a lot of those edge computing transitions had from the get-go included security from the planning stage all the way through execution. So I think whether it's talking to organizations about their vulnerability management challenges or seeing how they're managing their edge computing projects, we're seeing that transformation happening more and more, which is a great sign. The point of nothing can get delivered in the digital world now without taking security and privacy into account is just, it's a simple fact. So if those teams aren't collaborating, that organization is going to find themselves in hot water very quickly.
So you bring up privacy, which was actually perfect, because that was the crux of my next question. In the last couple of years, we've really seen privacy requirements just come almost out of nowhere. Like it's moved really, really quickly, I feel like, to where even having somebody's email address, and not just for consumers but enterprises also. We also have the converging effect of double, triple ransomware, where if there's any employee data stolen from a company getting ransomware, they're going after employees as well. And anything they can use for leverage on employees, I think is just helping a lot of the privacy legislation go along even further. How much of a challenge has that been for this kind of thing with a lot of these edge devices, tending to store and gather personal data, stuff that would be covered by some of these new privacy laws and requirements?
Yeah, that's been an interesting evolution. Seeing, think about a tablet in a hospital that you're using to check in, or even like most corporate buildings, you're going to use a tablet at the front desk to be able to check in for an appointment with whatever company on whichever floor. You're putting personal information into that experience. Between you and the next person stepping up to that device, the requirements now from a privacy perspective are very particular about making sure that needs to be wiped. Most of the hardware manufacturers and tablet manufacturers didn't really build in great experiences around that a few years back. More and more, we're seeing, like Apple and Google especially, having to deliver much better capabilities at the device level, so that your MDM solution can go in and be able to make sure that between user sessions, that nothing remains in there that could be captured or used or escape from that experience and become a PII issue. So that absolutely has been a significant evolution in the past 5 or so years in the market. It's one where there's continued kind of expansion of what those privacy laws are going after. I think your point about the double or triple methods of ransomware attackers to leverage, pressure on their victims, being able to steal the data, not just encrypt it, and then be, using that in different ways to try to leverage a ransom out of that attack, is a great example of why these privacy laws are continuing to expand and need to evolve. But yeah, it's definitely presented a huge challenge. It's presented a challenge from everything from the hardware level to the different software and applications that are running on these devices, and having to account for the edge computing use case pushes that boundary even further. You don't know how many people are going to come into contact with that device. You need to make it easy for the user to enter in information that can be captured and then, transmitted to the backend system, whatever it might be. If I'm doing a check-in, if I'm, entering information for some type of form, to maybe purchase something at a digital kiosk or something like that. All of that is information that's captured, needs to be secured, and then wiped from that user session so that somebody else couldn't capture it.
Yeah, and I think what Chris is really starting to allude to is we really have to start to take a look at the data lifecycle. Does the data that we are capturing now through these edge computing use cases, is that data protected? Is it trusted data? And then is it usable by whoever or whichever entity needs to be able to use it? And I think the whole conversation around privacy is really, really interesting. AT&T recently did a survey in conjunction with The Economist, and there was a big article that was published about a month ago on it. And it was along the lines of how people are looking at privacy from a biometric standpoint. And it's interesting that we as human beings, kind of where we draw the line on privacy, because the survey that AT&T and The Economist conducted was really looking at the use of biometrics in terms of being able to board a plane faster. So being able to have an airport, being able to have TSA, have your biometrics, and you being able to get through a security line much more quickly because your biometrics are stored. And what they found out in this survey is that a lot of people are just saying, oh, just wait a second, I'm not really willing to give up that much of my privacy. So it's really interesting where we as human beings really start to draw the line and say, enough is enough. We're willing to give photos of our vacation and, children and relatives, and be willing to give out your mother's unmarried name on social media. But they're kind of drawing the line on privacy in terms of biometrics. So I think that's really interesting. And a human's reaction is also going to cause some of these technologies to succeed or to fail or to require, more security built into things.
Yeah, one thing I saw, an interesting topic I saw a while ago was the idea, and I think this might have more traction in some other countries, not the U.S., maybe not Europe as much, but the idea that like healthcare specifically, that the individual has control over their data, and instead of me having to pay $10 to get my college transcripts or my medical history from my general care provider, instead I'm the one that owns it, and I lend it to them when I go in to get like a doctor's checkup or something like that. The ownership kind of shifts, and like there was a lot of bluster and hype around blockchain being used for it or something like that. But the general idea being that the individual becomes more in control of their own privacy, their own data. But on the flip side, what we saw with cryptocurrency and a lot of these things is individuals aren't very good at protecting that data in terms of availability. Losing hundreds of Bitcoins ever. Like everybody's got a story about the hundreds of Bitcoins that were on a hard drive. They can't remember where it is now. And, imagine that's your medical records, right? And they've got to be rebuilt from scratch or something like that. So is there still anything going on there? Any interest in that? Or was that just an idea that kind of fizzled out?
I mean, I think that's still really looking at the data lifecycle. How does the data lifecycle work? What is your role in your protecting your own data? We've like you mentioned, we've seen that happen in other geographies, and so it might be something that's taking hold in other geographies more so than the United States.
Okay. Yeah, and I think from a technology perspective, it's kind of one of those where having the right technologies in place is one thing, but then having agreement on how it's all going to work is going to be the other. So really, it's kind of that progression, that digital life cycle, that data life cycle is progressing towards like having your own identity wallet. What do you all have in your wallet? You've got maybe your social security number or personal identification number of some sort, your driver's license, your transcripts, your healthcare records, all these other things. One of the biggest challenges with this trying to get to that next evolution is to get everything to the point where it would be in even conceivably a handful of wallets is going to be a significant challenge of getting everybody to standardize on one way of doing things. Like, is everybody going to agree that blockchain's the right way and this is the technology to deliver that? And it's definitely something that people are desiring and wanting to strive towards. But I think we've hit a technology barrier on trying to get there because there's so many different ways currently on the table to try to tackle that. You could have government level identity wallets, and then you're going to need one for your healthcare system. And then if you're crossing over healthcare systems, do you need two? Are they going to standardize and collaborate to make it one type of system? I think there's definitely a desire to get to that level because I think it will give us a different level of digital freedom when it comes to everything personally identifiable. But there's a few technology hurdles to go there. So the hype cycle was really, really moving fast, and then slowed way down, and I think we're waiting to see when or if it'll pick back up in a significant way here.
Yeah, it seems like technically, your Apple Pay, Apple Wallet, Google Wallet, that stuff is kind of ready for this kind of thing, but maybe it's more regulatory stuff and
right.
The process is like I don't think the U.S. healthcare system is ready for the individual to control their own medical records.
Right. Yeah. Even for something like filing our taxes, almost every state does things a little bit differently yet. So it's the credit card systems and the pay wallets are the example of how it could be. But seeing this trickle out into the highly regulated, yeah, I think you're spot on there with that's going to be the leap. Can we make that technology leap with getting everybody to collaborate, work on doing things the same way?
Yeah. So talking about like consumer devices, does passwordless come in at all here? Where more and more, we've seen people's personal smartphones be an important element in. I don't know if that counts as edge computing, but how people authenticate with things, and maybe even extending to their smartwatches at this point, which are also more and more 5G enabled, where you can leave your phone behind and you still have always on connectivity to the internet to do pretty much what a phone can. A lot of smartwatches are just a small phone now. How is that kind of evolving with because I know Chris, you mentioned MDM earlier. Like that was a very sticky situation. I remember personally running into one company I worked for put MDM on people's personal phones, and a few people's phones got accidentally wiped, and they were not syncing their photos, and they lost a bunch of family photos. They're upset, and then the whole attitude in the organization about MDM just changed immediately, and everybody said, "No, if you want me to have email on my phone, you can give me a corporate device, and I'll just carry 2 smartphones with me."
Right. Yeah, I think the phone is a great example of where we start to see a lot of these collisions really start to pick up. We saw some of the phone vendors, the Android system really got good at having the enterprise versus personal separation on their devices, so that your MDM managed device can have the corporate side be wiped without affecting the personal side of it. So some of the time, these technologies, if we don't have the ecosystem working together, both the phone manufacturers making the capabilities and the separation work correctly so that the MDM vendor can do their piece and the end user gets a single device that they have to carry around, we end up with a lot more complexity and resistance to adopting technologies. Like, I wouldn't want to carry 2, phones around because most phones nowadays are not small, right? Having to juggle 2 phones constantly and be tethered to both devices for both personal and work is challenging for a lot of people. So yeah, I think the evolution has gotten there where more of these devices are now friendly enough for that BYOD use case to be more effective. But it's interesting to see where some of these devices using passwordless. We do have a passwordless authentication capability with our MDM solution. It makes it so that the user has their phone becomes their password basically. Now I can authenticate and get that push notification or scan a bar or a QR code and authenticate to whether it's a cloud solution or whatever else I might be logging into. As long as I've got my phone, I've got my authentication. I don't have to remember a password, and I get a much better overall experience because the number one attack against mobile devices yet is still to try to capture user credentials. So implementing something like that can absolutely remove one of the biggest security threats to that type of device and to the end user. We can't take the limits of humans out of the equation. They're never going to remember passwords. So trying to take the password out of the equation is the only way we have left. So it's definitely something that can drive a much more effective experience. But you're right, using a technology like that making sure that you've got that separation between people's personal lives and their corporate lives is very much important.
Yeah, and I think that multi-factor authentication is really, we're going to see more and more of that required. And it's interesting because, here we are, end of September, next month is October, so Cyber Awareness Month. And I was reading some of the talking points on what we're doing this year from an industry perspective on cyber awareness. And they're talking about multi-factor authentication, but they're also talking about stronger passwords. So it's just interesting, I think, that so many of us are saying, passwordless is probably the way to go, using multi-factor authentication, maybe with something such as biometrics and so on, because you don't have to remember anything. But yet here we are in 2023, and we're still very much concerned about passwords and the strength of passwords and the ability for passwords to be compromised, through stolen credentials. And then you also look at, Chris mentioned the number one sort of threat to mobile devices is that sort of stolen credentials. Then you start to be able to see things like account takeovers creep in, where somebody can impersonate somebody from a company asking for large sums of money. So we see these types of things in the types of attacks that are going on in the wild on a regular basis. So I just think that it's, still really interesting that here we are in 2023, and we're having this conversation still about passwords and the strength of passwords and how to maintain them. And should we go passwordless, or should we kind of stay with a password?
Yeah, fascinating. Well, a lot of fascinating stuff in this conversation today. Thank you so much, Theresa and Chris, for joining us today on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, we covered a lot of great ground here, and make sure you visit securityweekly.com/AT&T Cybersecurity to learn more and grab that 2023 AT&T Cybersecurity Insights report on the edge ecosystem that we've been alluding to and somewhat referencing throughout this conversation. We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.